There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. This episode is all about motors. In total, there are 3 different ways in which you can make your motors. There's the basic recipe, which requires 10 rotors plus 10 stators to make your 5 motors. You've also got the first alternate recipe called the electric motor, which requires electromagnetic control rods as well as rotors to make your motors. And the final recipe requires rotors again, stators, and crystal oscillators. Now, recipes like the crystal oscillator and electromagnetic control rods can get rather confusing. So what I've done is I've laid out all 3 of the recipes, the basic and the 2 alternates, as well as a couple other recipes which might massively benefit you. I'll also be showing you loads of different alternate recipes along the way as well. Starting with the basic motor recipe, and for all 5 examples today, I'll be making 5 motors per minute. To make these basic motors, you are going to need, again, 2 things: rotors and stators. Let's start off by talking about the rotors, since they're relatively easy. And of course, if you are trying to make your motors, you should already have a rotor setup going. If you haven't got one going, don't worry, it's relatively easy, and this is all that you are going to need. So you are going to need your iron rods and your screws. If you really wanted to, you can actually involve copper with this recipe using the copper sheets, or you could use the steel pipe and wire recipe. However, for this basic example, this is what we're going to go with. With the iron rods, luckily, like I've previously discussed in other videos, it's a 1:1:1 ratio. So in theory, your 50 iron ore creates your 50 iron rods. Over to the right of this though, when we're involving the screws, I do actually use one alternate recipe, and that is something called cast screws. This is an absolutely amazing recipe and by far one of my favorite in the game. Essentially, you can use your iron ingots straight into your screws without having to create iron rods. This ends up saving you on power, as well as the resources needed to make the constructor. Not to mention, it also saves you space as well. So if you're trying to make a blueprint factory, this tip is huge. That's what she said. I couldn't resist. You're only going to need 112.5 iron ore to create your 10 rotors. There is another fantastic rotor recipe which we'll be discussing a bit later on in today's video. Regardless, now let's move over to our stators. And for our stators, we need 2 things: steel pipes and wire. This may sound familiar, and there's a reason for that. And that's because, again, we have got the rotor alternate recipe which uses the exact same items: wire and steel pipe. So if you so wish, you could also use that over here as well, which means you'll only have to create steel pipes and wire rather than all the screws and additional iron rods. Regardless, when it comes to the wire, we need 80 wire per minute, which is 40 copper ingots, which is 40 copper ore. A very simple thing to make. When it comes to the steel pipes, I'm using a couple different recipes. Firstly, I'm using a steel ingot and concrete recipe. This is called molded pipe. Reason for this is rather simple. If you were to make the regular steel pipe, which is nothing really wrong with doing this, you need 30 steel ingots, which requires 30 coal and 30 iron to make 20 steel pipe. However, with this recipe, to make your 20 steel pipe, you now only need 20 steel ingots, so you save 33% of your coal and your iron. You do have to use a bit more concrete, but depending on where you spawned and where you're trying to build this thing, there should be a lot of concrete lying around, and it's very easy to make. Especially if you use this wet concrete recipe in the refinery, and I'll talk about the refinery throughout today's video since it plays quite a crucial role in one of our later recipes. However, that is not the only alternate recipe we are using in this project. As you can see, for our basic steel ingots, it's a 1:1:1 ratio. So 18 iron ore plus 18 coal creates 18 steel ingots. That's not bad, but we can do better. We can do that with the solid steel ingot recipe. This way you can create 60 steel ingots from just 40 iron ingots and 40 coal per minute. So again, you're also saving 1/3 of your coal and 1/3 of your iron this way. You do have to make the iron ingots separately in a smelter or the refinery, so this will consume more power and take up more room, but again, you are saving iron if you so wish. Not to mention you're also saving coal, which you might want to use later on. And just doing these 2 simple tricks, we end up saving a good amount of coal and a good amount of iron. You don't have to save these 2 resources if you don't want to. This is more of a personal thing, but you might as well save resources when you can, right? Especially when it's rather cheap to do and it only involves a little bit of limestone. Essentially, that's the basic recipe. It's extremely simple to do. So let's see how many items this actually requires. In total, it's 132.5 iron ore, which is not too bad at all, 40 copper ore, which is essentially nothing, 20 coal per minute, and 54 limestone per minute. The numbers here are really small, really. Like, there's not anything complicated in this. The only annoying part is that it requires 4 different types of raw resources: iron, copper, coal, and limestone. This is a bit of a pain when it comes to logistics and trying to find a good location for it, since the odds are you might not find the best place that has all 4 of these available right next to each other, which I'm sure you can, but not everywhere. Without revealing too much, I have got a very simple solution for this at the very end of the video, which you might actually quite like. Just before we continue, if you guys like videos like this, I have got a ton more tips, tricks, and tutorials on the channel, so make sure to subscribe if Satisfactory is a game that you end up enjoying. Considering this is the basic recipe, it's not even that bad. However, let's try and move on to our second recipe of the day, which is the electric motor recipe, and as you can see, this one's a bit more of a big boy, and that's to do with the electromagnetic control rods, because we need 2.5 of them, whereas we only need 5 rotors per minute. Going back to our basic example here for a minute, this required 10 rotors per minute, so we are using half the amount of rotors. It's made the exact same way like I've already shown previously, but of course, half the required ores, which is fantastic. Moving on though to the electromagnetic control rods, this requires stators and AI limiters. Very quickly, I do want to talk about the stators because here we are only consuming 3.75 per minute, whereas again, for our very first example, we are using 10 per minute. This is absolutely huge. Not only do we only use half the rotors, but we're using about just over a third of the stators, which is fantastic. The only downside to this is the AI limiters. But when you have a quick look at what this actually involves, it's not that bad. We're only making 2.5 AI limiters per minute for the 2.5 electromagnetic control rods. This means we have to consume 12.5 copper sheets, which requires 25 copper ingots or 25 copper ore. I have got a much better recipe for this that I'll show you later on, but it does require water and refineries. And of course you get water from the water extractors, which then requires power, and you have to get that from point A to your factory. That requires time and more logistics. So to keep things nice and simple, I've just done the very basic method, which you can make in your constructor rather than a refinery. The second thing you then need to use for your AI limiters is quick wire. You need 50 quick wire per minute, which is made from 10 caterium ingots per minute, which is then made from 30 caterium ore. Again, I have got a better recipe for this, which I'll be showing you later on. And I think, in my opinion at least, this is the best AI limiter recipe. But there's also another one you could use if you so wish, and that's this one right here. The reason why I'm not using it is purely because of plastic. I do not want to be getting crude oil involved in projects, which it doesn't have to be involved in. But in case you are interested, to make our 2.5 AI limiters, we need 37.5 quickwire, which is less than what we're currently using, but we need 8.75 plastic. This is not a lot of plastic, like, honestly, it's very good. So if you are making excess plastic and you don't know what to do with it, and you want to try and save on your quickwire, then by all means, feel free to use this. The reason, again, as to why I'm not using it personally, is because I don't want to belt out plastic to this project, because it's quite far away from where I've currently built all my plastic stuff. But again, if you have got it nearby, you can consider doing this. We've also got ourselves another electromagnetic control rod recipe. This uses less stators, but requires high-speed connectors. There's 2 different ways that you can make these high-speed connectors, but unfortunately, these all require the manufacturer, which you might not have at the stage of the game that you're currently in. Not to mention, they also consume a lot of quick wire, and cable, which requires copper, and circuit boards, which again could require plastic, or you could go with a silicon recipe, which only requires silica, and more copper. Regardless, I think the high-speed connectors are a bit more tedious to make, so I do recommend sticking with the recipe I've just shown. However, I still wanted to give you guys those alternate recipes just in case you might have preferred them to what I have shown here anyway. Regardless, now let's have a quick look at everything we are consuming. First of all, iron ore, 63.75. That's just over a Mark 1 conveyor belt's worth, not too bad. Copper ore, we're looking at 40 per minute. Coal, of course, this is going to be less at 7.5 per minute. Limestone, again, this is going to be less at 20.25 per minute. However, we are using Caterium for this project, whereas with the basic recipe, we are not. So that's 2 recipes down. We've still got one more left to go, and that is the Rigor Motor. And I know that a lot of people see this, especially one thing over here, and are instantly put off by this recipe. So, should you be put off by it? Is it secretly overpowered? Let's have a quick look now. First of all, we are only consuming 2.5 rotors per minute. This is half of the electric motor recipe and 1/4 of the basic recipe, so you are saving a lot of iron from this already. And again, when it comes to status, we're only making 2.5 per minute. This is less than the electric motor recipe, so if we were to look at just this part of the motor recipe, it's not that bad at all. We are only using 1/4 of what we're using for the basic recipe. Unfortunately though, we've still got the crystal oscillator to try and talk about. When it comes to the crystal oscillator, there are 2 different recipes. You've got the basic recipe, and then of course you've got the alternate insulated crystal oscillator recipe. The only reason as to why I'm not making this personally is because, again, of rubber. If you are making excess rubber, you might actually really enjoy this recipe. However, I don't want to be making rubber just for the crystal oscillators. It's not worth it for me. And if you don't want to get crude oil involved at all, then the basic recipe is the one for you. Although one thing I will say is that if you use the alternate recipe, you end up saving a good amount of quartz crystals. So to make our 15 quartz crystals per minute, we need 25 raw quartz. It's not that bad, it's pretty easy to make. And luckily for us, we're only needing 11.7 cable per minute, which requires 23.4 wire per minute, 11.7 copper ingots per minute, and then 11.7 copper ore, which again, is relatively cheap. The final thing is just 2.1 reinforced iron plates per minute, which requires your iron plates and your screws. Remember here, we are using the cast screw recipe, so we are not making iron rods. This just saves you time, effort, resources, power, space, just everything, literally everything. So let's just take a step back very quick. To begin with, this looked like an absolute nightmare, especially because of the crystal oscillators. But now that we can look at it from this angle, and we can see how little resource we're actually using, it doesn't seem as bad. In total, this is exactly what we are using for the Rigor Motor. It's 58.325, a bit of a weird number, I do apologize for that, but that's just, it is what it is, as the phrase goes. Iron per minute, 22.7 copper ore per minute, just 5 coal per minute. I mean, if anything, that's actually almost too low. It feels like it's almost unnecessary just to get 5 coal per minute out here, which I have got a solution for that, so stay tuned. 25 raw quartz per minute, again, nothing really. And 13.5 limestone, again, nothing. Before I get onto these 2 secret recipes, quote unquote, let's analyze these 3 recipes and their total raw resources being consumed. And remember, the lower the amount of raw resources, the more likely you'll be saving on power, time, space, and energy. Let's have a quick look into this. So, for iron, for the basic recipe we are using 132.5, for the electric we're only using 63.75, but the best resource to save on iron is the Rigor Motor. It's also the best recipe to saving on copper, at 22.7 compared to 40 and again 40. It's also the best recipe for coal, when you only have to use 5 per minute compared to 7.5 and 20 per minute. And it's also the best on saving on limestone, where you only consume 13.5 per minute compared to 20.25 and 54 per minute. The only downside with these 2 recipes compared to the basic is that you have to use either Caterium or quartz. So if you have got one of these 2 resources lying around, feel free to do this. But if you don't want to get Caterium or quartz involved, you might prefer using this recipe. But before I sell you on this recipe, I want to show you 2 more. And the first one actually is just the Rigor Motor, but I've done a bit of extra work. Here it is right here. Just in case you couldn't think it can get any more complicated, I've done it. And that's because I've used something called Pure Ingots recipes. And if you've been watching my channel for the last few weeks, you know exactly where we're going with this. In case you didn't know, in the refinery, if you were to type the word pure into here, you get access to something called pure ingots as well as pure quartz crystals. With these pure ingots, you end up saving an absolute ton of resources. For example, rather than requiring 162.5 iron ore to make the 162.5 iron ingots, it's only 87.5. The catch is that you now require water, and like I was mentioning earlier, to make water, you need water extractors. This costs you more power and of course the resources needed to make it, and you have to transport it to your factory. And of course the refinery is huge, so if you're trying to make a blueprint build, this might set you back quite a lot. Not to mention, again, it also consumes more power. The reason for this, of course, is because otherwise this would be extremely overpowered, because you don't just save out on iron, for example, but you also save on copper, you save on caterium, you save on quartz crystals, and like the concrete I showed you earlier as well, you can use wet concrete, which saves you on limestone. So let's take our findings from the refinery and actually add it to this recipe. And that's essentially what I've done. So let's use our pure ingots into our Rigor Motor recipe. When it comes to iron ingots, I'm using pure iron ingots. Of course, though, with steel ingots, we're already using my preferred recipe for it anyway, so I'm not going to touch that. When it comes to our concrete, again, we can use the wet concrete recipe. When it comes to copper, we can use the wet copper ingots recipe or the pure ingot recipe. When it comes to quartz crystals, again, we can use the water recipe for that as well. And before you know it, we have used quite a lot of water, but we've also saved on a lot of resources. I have made a before and after comparison to see if this is actually worth it, but of course I'm not including power. If you're using refineries, you will be consuming more power. Simple. But probably not as much power as you think. Before, we required 58.325 iron ore, now we only need 31.47. That is just over half a Mark 1 conveyor belt. That is amazing. When it comes to copper ore, rather than using 22.7, we are now only using 8.4. These numbers are astronomically low. Like, again, we are making 5 motors per minute. We're not making something silly here. We are making a fairly middle-staged item here, especially if you are newer towards the game. This might be the most complex thing you've ever made, so this will save you a lot of time. When it comes to core, again, it's the exact same. With raw quartz, you barely save anything, so you might not want to use that. And when it comes to limestone, again, you're saving about half your limestone. And we are only using roughly 40 water per minute. One water extractor gives you 120 water per minute. So you're only using 1/3 of your water extracted potential, which is amazing. Normally it's this part of the video where I say, this is the best recipe to use for motors in Satisfactory, and then I'll do my outro. But there is one final example I want to use, and this example will be fantastic if you are a newer player, or you simply, like me, cannot be asked to do all of this. The one problem with it is that it does consume quite a lot of iron, but it only consumes iron. That is right, we are using the basic motor recipe with 11 herbs and spices. This way we are again making our 10 rotors per minute, but we are using something called iron pipe. With the iron pipe, you only have to use iron ingots to make it. With the wire, we are using something called iron wire, which requires iron to make the wire. This way you don't need copper for the wire, and you don't need coal for your steel. When it comes to our stator recipe, again, it's pretty much the exact same thing. Steel pipe, wire, and wire. We are only using 80 wire here though, which is actually not that bad, and we're still using our iron wire and iron steel pipe recipe. This way we are consuming 278.4 iron per minute, and that is it. Nothing else, just iron. And if you do want to use the pure iron ingot recipe, this is going to set you back 150 iron ore and about 86 water per minute. So to conclude, to make the best motor recipe, you need to use the Rigor Motor. You can use this without water, or you can implement water as well if you wish to try and save on resources. However, the simplest motor recipe is the basic recipe using iron pipe and iron wire. I really hope this video managed to help you guys out. I thoroughly enjoyed getting all this evidence together, and if you do enjoy videos like this, let me know in the comments down below. I've got a ton more videos just like this on my channel. Without further ado, thank you for watching. Before we go, a massive thank you to our members, Mau Mau, Skull and Hattie, Lo, Nitormal, Chaos Rising, Cutthroat Zoo, Yummy Kel, and Tio Rico.